Hey, I think you need to back up a little bit. There, that's better. Today we're talking about speed boosters, but not just any speed booster. It's the Pixco M42 to NEX speed booster. So what is a speed booster and why would you need one? Well, I recently upgraded from my Sony a7 III to my Sony FX30. I mainly do video work, so I wanted a cinema camera that also didn't break the bank. I shoot a lot on these old vintage lenses from Pentax. These are the Takumar lenses, and they technically cover a full frame sensor. So when you're using a crop sensor like the FX30, I'm going to lose some of that field of view. I can thread this lens onto the I can attach this speed booster onto the lens in order to get a more wider field of view on an APS-C sensor. For a speed booster, it's actually very cheap. It's about 90 USD. It feels like it's mostly metal. It's got the glass in the middle for the speed boosting aspect, and the threads are metal, not coated, so that's actually a plus. I decided to compare the speed booster to my Photesi regular adapter. I used my 50mm SMC Takumar lens as well as the speed booster to see how the optics compare after the speed boost. I do want to make a disclaimer though. Since these tests weren't done with the best tools or the most accurate processes, we are looking for major distinct differences. I do expect some minor differences to be present due to what I had at my disposal. However, I did try to keep things as consistent as possible within these means to yield the best results. The first test was the color test. Unfortunately, the Sony a7 III, which you see now, has different color science than the Sony FX30. However, what we really want to focus on is the change in tint in the white areas. Applying the same white balance correction from the a7 III to the FX30 shows that you will find a greenish tint in the speed booster. If I decide to correct to the proper white for both images, you'll also notice that the speed booster has a little bit more contrast in the blacks. Now, take this info with a grain of salt because we were using two different bodies with two different color sciences on two different sensors. So once again, we're only really looking at the major distinct differences. When taking a look at sharpness, you can tell that the speed booster softens the edges quite a bit on the image. And this may not necessarily be a bad thing because it does actually help the cinematic look. Unfortunately, if you are trying to preserve the original characteristics of that lens, then you may be out of luck here. And if you couldn't already tell, this speed booster obviously does not get you to a 1:1 ratio of the original focal length. In order to get the lenses to the same focal distance, I had to apply a 12% crop in Premiere to the regular adapter footage. And taking a look while we're here, our distortion test reveals that there's a little extra distortion added when the speed booster is equipped. It's minor distortion, but you're able to tell when you go back and forth quickly, as well with the softness and the vignetting on the edges. In addition to this, when I set the test up, I was at the minimum focus distance on the speed booster. However, on the regular adapter, I actually still had more room to focus closer to the lens. Being that it's a speed booster, you would expect the speed or aperture to be boosted, and yes, this actually does that. In Premiere, it took an extra 1.5 points of exposure to match the adapter to the speed booster, which is actually a massive difference. Having that extra light is super helpful actually for these vintage lenses, because despite this one being an f1.4, in general, these lenses are usually around an f3.5, so you're losing quite a bit of light there on the minimum aperture, which you can then actually gain back with the speed booster, and that's a huge added benefit. I also want to mention that these vintage lenses don't really get that wide. I think the widest that the Takumars come in is 17mm. And if you don't put a speed booster on there, you're actually looking at a 25mm equivalent, which isn't as wide as you may want it. For comparison, I'm shooting on a 12mm lens right now, with some cropping, of course. Going outside for our flare test, you'll notice that the flares are actually pretty subdued and there's not a lot of color in them. Also, please excuse the dirty sensor as I was swapping lenses a lot in this video. But if you take a look at the speed booster, you'll notice the flares actually gain quite a bit of color. And it's interesting in a way that I actually enjoy, and I think it kind of makes it more cinematic. And here are just some regular shots for comparison that I replicated on both the adapters. So final thoughts. Is the Pixco Speedbooster from M42 to Sony E-mount adapter worth buying at its price range? Well, unfortunately, you don't have much of a choice. So from my research, I couldn't find any competition for M42 to Sony E-mount speed boosters. I did find that there were some speed boosters that went to Fuji from other brands, but for Sony, it seems like this is the only one at this time. Anyways, that was my quick review of the M42 to Sony E-mount speed booster from Pixco. Again, because it's such a niche product, I don't think I've seen many reviews out there before I was able to buy it, so I figured why not make one for the people who are curious. I have picked up a couple of other products that I want to take a look at and review because there isn't much info on them. If you have suggestions for my next one, please leave it in the comments below. And thank you so much for watching. I'd appreciate a subscribe or a thumbs up. Anything helps. Thanks. Peace.